You're listening to the Physical Performance Show. I'm Inigo Mujika. I'm a sports physiologist and a triathlon and swimming coach. And today we're going to be talking about a very important phase of training, which is the tapering phase in the lead up to major competitions. I hope you enjoy the show.
That's the voice of this week's guest on this expert edition around all things tapering for endurance athletes, Inigo Mujika, world-acclaimed expert on all things endurance sports, tapering and peaking.
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show. I'm Brad Beer, sports physiotherapist and exercise scientist by trade and training, and founder of Pogo Physio. Each week, we'll bring you the latest and greatest information and inspiration designed to help you perform at your physical best. And of course, we do this across a range of different episodes: coaches' corners, interest editions, featured performers, and the always so popular expert editions. And today, episode 254, you are in for an absolute treat with this week's featured guest, Inigo Mujika. Now, exploring all things best practices when it comes to endurance sports tapering has been on the wish list for many years. And I'm so excited that this week we get to share with you the teachings from arguably the planet's preeminent expert in this very field. Now, Inigo Mujika is one of our very popular prior guests, colleagues Shona Halson, recovery science expert, and Shona indicated that when it comes to tapering, Inigo Mujika is the mind that we want to extract the learnings from. So you're going to need a pen and paper today, I promise you. Now, by way of bio, where do you start with an expert like Inigo Mujika? Inigo is an avid researcher, sports science practitioner, and a coach applying his academic learnings. Since 1992, Inigo has been devoted to the research of tapering and peaking for sports performance. He's published many peer-reviewed scientific articles, many book chapters, and 5 books. As a sports physiologist, Inigo works closely with elite athletes and coaches in a variety of individual and team sports. Inigo currently serves as a head of sports science for Spanish Aquatics and has previously served roles with the Australian Institute of Sport from 2003 to 2004. In 2005, Inigo worked as a physiologist and trainer of the professional road bicycle racing team Euskaltel Euskadi. He's also coached world-class triathletes, including Olympians Angel Marua and also Enrico Lanos. So you get a sense for Inigo's pedigree and expertise on this topic of tapering. Now, what can you expect from today's episode? Well, we've all tried to either conduct our own tapers or have had tapers programmed for us from coaches, and we all know that sometimes they go well, sometimes they don't. So through today's learnings, you'll be able to extract the scientific body of work, the evidence-based best practices when it comes to tapering. Inigo will share the definition of tapering and peaking, outline the main aim of tapering, share why if a taper goes well, you can expect up to a 3% improvement between pre- and post-taper performances. Inigo outlines the 3 variables that can be manipulated with a taper: training intensity, training volume, and training frequency. Inigo shares from a 2011 landmark scientific review the best practices when it comes to endurance sports tapers in terms of length, what to do with reducing volume, and what not to do when it comes to tinkering with intensity and training frequency. Inigo explores nutrition and hydration practices through a taper and outlines why it is key to arrive at your racing body mass at the start of the taper rather than at the end. And finally, Inigo outlines what actually occurs when we taper in terms of physiological effects, and then what occurs at the end of a season when we take a break, the detraining effects, and then what we can expect with the retraining effects physiologically as we return to training. There's the single piece of advice and, of course, the physical challenge for the week. I know you are going to really love this expert edition. There is so many learnings to extract. Here is my conversation with Inigo Mujika, sports physiologist and tapering expert. Inigo Mujika, this has been on my wish list for some time, and this is a topic that we are yet to really focus on the Physical Performance Show after 4 and a bit years. So tapering for endurance athletes. We arguably couldn't pick a more expertise expert in yourself. So welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Brad. Thanks for the invitation.
Well, I mean, as per my bio, your professional career has been very deep, and your professional work, the books, the consulting, your sports science work, you're coordinating your exercise physiology, your academia. What has your current role look like through 2020, Inigo?
Well, at the moment, I always work as a freelance, but or most of the time. But at the moment, what is taking up most of my time is sports science coordinator role for Spanish Aquatics. So I have a role over pool swimming and open water swimming, and also water polo, men's and women's water polo, diving, and synchronized swimming. I don't do much with synchronized swimming and diving. I'm available for consultation if needed, and I do some contributions for them here and there, but most of the time is dedicated to swimming and open water swimming, and then camps-based dedication to mostly women's water polo. I'm also teaching in different universities, master's degree teaching, and a bit of consulting with a couple of companies.
And then obviously your academia has played a huge role in your career to date, and I'm sure you're still contributing in the academic world as well.
Yes, I had 5 hours of lecturing yesterday and another 5 hours the day before here at the University of the Basque Country at the master's degree level. And I'm also invited lecturer at different universities around the world. I'm a professor, adjunct professor at the University Finisterra in Santiago de Chile. And then I do some invited lecturing at a university in Madrid, another one in Barcelona, another one in Reykjavik in Iceland.
Wow.
So a lot of fun.
You're international man of the continents, and I hope you're well tapered, Inigo, for those 2 5-hour lecture stints.
Yeah, no choice.
Inigo, in the books, I just picked up what I believe was one of the final 61 copies left in the only print of tapering and peaking for optimal performance, which I can't wait to get in my hands. It's been shipped from the US, but I was intrigued when I saw the foreword by the great Spanish cyclist Miguel Indurain.
Yes, I asked him to do it, and he did me that favor. So yeah, I was very pleased with that too.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can't wait to get that in the post. And then your other books, as per the bio, but you were speaking about swimming. There's the World Book of Swimming, From Science to Performance.
Yes, I've always been involved in swimming, and that's a project that I had in the past. Then it was stopped. It never went anywhere. And then a couple of colleagues from France decided to rescue my project. And of course, because it was initially my project, they invited me to join them as editor of the book. So that's a book that we edit, and in which we invite experts from all over the world, swimming experts from all over the world to write the different chapters. So yeah, that was an interesting project that I thought would never see the light, but it ended up being published. Yeah.
Well, that's one of your numerous publications. Inigo, the theme for this expert edition is tapering for the endurance athlete. Now, tapering, I think most athletes, coaches, practitioners feel like they've got a sense for what it is. But what's the definition of tapering, a taper?
Well, there are many different definitions if you look at the scientific literature, but basically it is a period of reduced training load in the lead up to major competitions. So it's a strategy to optimize performance in the lead up to major competitions, and it's characterized by reducing the training load, which is a little bit counterintuitive because coaches and athletes are always trying to increase the training load, increase how much they train, how often they train, how hard they train. And here we are saying that when you really want to optimize your performance, what you should be doing is reduce how much you train. So that's a little bit counterintuitive, but it has been proven to be very effective when you want to really reach a peak of fitness and performance and dissipate the accumulated fatigue that, or the fatigue that has been accumulating throughout the intensive training phases.
So it's about dissipating that cumulative fatigue through the training phase to try and maximize the performance. And your colleague and co-contributor on numerous papers of yours, Dr. Shona Halson, associate professor, she had the little adage that fatigue isn't the enemy. We want fatigue as athletes, but then it's a matter of removing it appropriately to try and maximize performance.
The question is how much fatigue and when you are accumulating that fatigue and when you are getting rid of it. So the aim of the taper, or the main aim of the taper, is to get rid of that accumulated fatigue and at the same time reach a fitness peak that will allow, let's say, a maximum difference, a maximum range between your fitness peak and the lowest level of your fatigue. That's when the potential for optimal performance arrives, when there is a maximum difference between your fitness level and your accumulated fatigue is very low.
So low levels of cumulative fatigue and maximum fitness.
Correct. At the beginning of this of my studies with tapering, we thought that almost the only aim of the taper was to dissipate fatigue so that the fitness that you already had could show up.
Yeah. Because
we used to say that your accumulated fatigue was hiding your fitness and therefore your performance potential. And when you drop the training load, because fatigue dissipates quicker than you lose fitness, then that fitness level that you had could appear. But in further studies, we have seen that not only you can dissipate fatigue and maintain the fitness that you already have during the taper, but you can reach additional levels of fitness. So you can increase that difference between your peak fitness and your lowest level of fatigue.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess, and that was the next question I had, Inigo, and that is, what's the difference between peaking and tapering?
Well, peaking is trying to reach your optimal performance level, your optimal fitness level, and tapering is a way that you might or might not use to reach that performance peak. Some people often misread the idea of tapering. They say, well, once I am in the final 2 to 3 weeks before the competition, I'm tapering. No, you might or might not be tapering. You might decide not to use this training strategy. So even if you are 10 days away from competition, you might not be tapering. Maybe you have decided to try to reach a performance peak in a different way that is not reducing the training load. So tapering is a way to peak your fitness and your performance.
That makes sense. So even though you may be 2 weeks out from an event, if you're not consciously planning or organizing your training in a manner that's fitting with a taper, then you're not tapering.
Correct. Yeah. Correct. You might decide that you are going to reach a performance peak by training more. In that case, you are trying to reach a fitness and performance peak, but not tapering. You are having a different approach to getting that fitness and performance peak.
Because the taper must have a reduction in workload.
Correct, by definition.
By definition, yes. Inigo, what are the characteristics of a taper? What are the variables that athletes, coaches, practitioners in the field can manipulate in a taper?
Okay, I just said that by definition, the taper is a phase of reduced training load. And there are different ways of reducing the training load. Obviously, you can manipulate training intensity, you can manipulate training volume, you can manipulate training frequency. Those are the three key variables by which you might reduce the training load. What we have found is that you should not reduce the training load at the expense of training intensity, because training intensity is key to retain the adaptations that you have previously achieved and to optimize the adaptations that you still don't have during that period. Reducing training intensity is usually not an option. Training frequency is the other option, that is taking away some of your training sessions. And what we have found is that in highly trained athletes, and particularly when the technical aspect of performance is very important, the training load should not be reduced at the expense of frequency, or at least not too much, because the athletes need to keep that feel and they need to maintain that technical efficiency in their athletic gesture. So yeah, you can eliminate one session here, one session there, but mostly with the goal of reducing the total training load. So basically, you are left with manipulating training volume. So the main recommendation is that when you try to reduce the training load during the taper, what you should reduce the most is the training volume, not training intensity. Well, if you're a triathlete and you are doing 15 or 18 sessions a week, it's not a problem if you take out 2, 3, 4 sessions a week, and that's the way by which you reduce the training volume. But in other sports, if you are only training once a day, it might be a good idea to still train once a day, but train shorter, train less volume.
So it's about, of those three variables, it's about really the volume being manipulated, because intensity is what we want to keep in there. We need to be aware of high technical sports, reducing the frequency because the athlete may lose feel and skills, or just that sense of I'm in the sweet spot. That makes sense. And then it's your work and the meta-analysis that yourself and colleagues published in Tapering for Competition, a review published in 2011. It's not just a guess game. There's hard science that your team and yourself have outputted here, correct? Around how much volume reduction may be best.
Yeah, the idea behind that meta-analysis was to try to take out the guesswork and facilitate coaches and practitioners and athletes reaching a performance peak more often than they don't. So the idea is that if you apply the principles that came out of that meta-analysis, you might hit the target more often than you miss the target. It doesn't mean that you don't need to individualize the tapering strategy, that you don't need to fine-tune for particular adaptation characteristics of individual athletes, but at least you have a solid starting point that might be where what you can try as a tapering strategy, and depending on the outcomes, then you can fine-tune here and there. But it's a good starting point when you don't know an athlete and you don't know what tapering strategy you should be using. Just follow the recommendations of that meta-analysis and you got a big chance of getting it right. Then you might need to tweak it here and there, but the chances that you're going to get the taper right are much bigger than if you start from scratch and you have absolutely no idea what you are doing.
Which is more the trial and error, game. Yeah,
it's better than trial and error. It's trial and error on a solid basis.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Inigo. I mean, if you don't know an athlete and you're not following some level of recommendation, then you're really just trial and erroring. But with these recommendations, you're going to reduce the likelihood of that. Can you summarize some of the recommendations that you did find in that meta-analysis, Inigo?
Yeah, well, we realized that the ideal for the majority of athletes reduction of training volume would be between 41 and 60% compared to the volume of the pre-taper mesocycle. Training intensity should be maintained during the taper, similar to the previous mesocycle. Training frequency, as we said before, could be reduced by, my recommendation would be not to reduce by more than 20%. And then there is the duration of the taper. How long before the main competition you should start reducing the training load? And in that sense, what came out of the meta-analysis is that you can be successful with a taper lasting 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, even 4 weeks. But their recommendation that would suit most athletes and that has less risk of getting it wrong is a 2-week taper. And that has been shown not only for endurance athletes, also for team sport athletes and even strength-oriented athletes. There are some particular athletes that have an adaptation and disadaptation profile that would benefit from a longer taper, and some others might benefit from a shorter taper. But as a general rule, 2 weeks would be a good starting point, and then depending on the outcomes, we could make it a little bit longer or make it a little bit shorter. But 2 weeks would be a good strategy. And then finally, we can manipulate how we reduce the training load. Do we go for a sudden standard reduction? That's what we call a step taper. Let's say you are running 10 kilometers a day, and suddenly you decide, well, from tomorrow on, the next 2 weeks, I'm going to run 5 kilometers a day. I'm going to reduce my training volume by half. But there is no progression in the reduction of the training load. It's a constant reduction. Or you could reduce the training load linearly. So you start by running, instead of running 10 kilometers, which might be your daily average, you say, first day of the taper, I'm going to run 9.2. Second day, 8.5. Third day, 7.8. Fourth day, 7.2. And so on until the day before the competition, you ran 2.5 kilometers. Or you might reduce exponentially, which means that there is a big initial drop, and then the reduction tends to be tends to stabilize. And that exponential reduction of the training load might be done very quickly, which would be an exponential taper with a fast decay, or it can be done slower, which would be an exponential taper with a slow decay. Of course, the total training load of the different strategies is often not the same. Because if you drop really fast, that means that by the end of the taper, the accumulated training load over 2 weeks is going to be, normally, it's going to be less than if you do a slower or a linear reduction. According to the meta-analysis, for the majority of endurance sports, a progressive strategy, which would include the linear decrease and the exponential decrease, is usually better than a step standardized reduction strategy. And progressive means usually that the exponential strategy is better than the linear strategy as well.
So if you're an endurance athlete or coach, consider this exponential taper model as opposed to definitely the step, and then be aware of whether you do it in a fast fall off or a slow fall off.
Correct. And there is one exception there. According to the meta-analysis, we found that cycling might benefit from a step reduction, a standardized reduction. But if you mix the findings of the meta-analysis with my personal experience working in professional cycling, I would tell you that a progressive strategy, whether linear or exponential, might be perfectly suitable for a professional cyclist racing for 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, short-term cycling tours. Whereas the step taper might be a good strategy when you are preparing for a grand tour, a 3-week tour like the Tour de France, Italian Giro, or Spanish Vuelta. In that case, maybe the step taper strategy for a shorter period might be a good option.
And in your experience, Inigo, as you say, working alongside these teams, how far out in duration might they start the step? Is it your classical 2 weeks or longer if it's going to be a grand tour?
I would do it shorter. Or I did it shorter. I used to do 7 to 10 day reduction of the training load, but it was a very marked reduction, like down to 50% of the usual training volume.
Yeah, so quite a step reduction, but less than 14 days.
That's what I did. It doesn't mean that that's what people should be doing.
Did the riders take the top step? The general classification?
No, there is only one taking that top step out of 189, so it's not very easy.
It's tough. Did you ask McGill Indurain how he used to taper, Inigo?
Well, at that time, I was only on the side. I was just analyzing data. I wasn't giving training advice.
Yeah, no, of course. On that, when I was on the side as a junior triathlete growing up in the 1990s here in Australia, the adage used to be that the longer the event on race day, so in the world of triathlon, if it was going to be an Ironman, you would need a longer taper than if it was, say, an Olympic distance race. Is there anything you'd add to that? Is that just a complete myth, or is there some basis for that, Inigo, with regards to the duration of a taper?
Yeah, that's a very good question. There is no scientific basis to support that statement. We've looked at different duration events in different sports, like comparing 50-meter swimmers against 200-meter swimmers and 1,500-meter swimmers. We have looked at tapers for cross-country runners versus marathon runners or 10K runners. Nothing comes up in that sense. So I personally think that it's purely dependent on the individual profile of the adaptation and disadaptation. And that means that within the Olympic distance, you might have athletes who recover very quickly and reach a super compensation peak very quickly. And you might have athletes who need longer to recover and they need longer to reach a super compensation peak. And within the Ironman distance, you might have also different adaptation and disadaptation profiles. So I don't think it's the event and the event duration that determines how you should taper. I think it's the type of athlete that you are that is going to determine how you should taper.
That's brilliant and profound. It's not the event, but it's the type of athlete that you are. And obviously athletes working with coaches and people in the field like yourself and your expertise, I guess they discover that with the help of people around them. But for the athlete, that say the age group athlete, is there any way that they can get a handle on their profile for adaptation to training and disadaptation? Is there anything you'd recommend there practically, Inigo?
That's very difficult. That's something that came out of the application of mathematical modeling and systems theory to our swimmers. That was part of my PhD studies. You know, when I gave the results of the data of 18 elite swimmers to the coaches, they said, "Thank you, we knew that." But the good thing is that the findings that we came up with from the application of the mathematical model was reinforcing the perceptions that the coaches already had about their swimmers. You know, coaches are there every day. They see whether an athlete takes a long time to recover or whether they recover very quickly. They see whether they lose fitness as soon as they drop the training load or they are able to maintain fitness for a very long time. Our data were simply a confirmation of the perceptions that the coaches already had. So if you assess your adaptation and you think about how you are adapting and how you are competing and how you are feeling before and after the competitions, you should be able to determine what type of athlete you are. Going back to that question about shorter distances before or longer distances. When I coached Eneko Llanos for 10 years, we applied the same tapering strategy when he was in the Olympic distance and when he was winning Ironman races. On the other hand, with his brother Hector, when he moved up to the Ironman distance, we had to manipulate the tapering strategy because we didn't seem to get it right. And at the end, we came up with a strategy that was a two-phase taper, consisting on reducing the training load a little bit earlier than usual, and then rebuilding the training load in the lead up to the Ironman event. Why? Because he felt that when he dropped the training load continuously until the very last day before an Ironman event, he felt flat. He said, well, suddenly I'm asking my body to perform for 8.5 hours when in the last few days I've been performing or I've been training for only, 2 hours or 1.5 hours. So he felt that he needed to readapt to those long duration efforts before approaching the competition. And it worked really well. That two-phase taper worked really well for him. But I had also tried that with Eneco Llanos, and it didn't work for him. And he said, I don't feel good rebuilding my training load in the lead up to the Ironman. I like to feel very, very fresh before the Ironman. We applied to the Ironman the same approach that we had applied before to the ITU long distance event that when he won World Championships. And that was very, very similar, if not identical, to the approach that we had when he was racing in the Olympic distance. So that was more about his profile and how he adapted than about the event.
So once again, just reinforcing that message, it's less about the event demands and it's more about the individual profile of the athlete. And one thing that jumped out there, Inigo, is the importance of perception of the athlete, the observations of the coach that, you're feeling good with this or you're not. Louis Delahai, Dutch cycling triathlon coach, commented on a prior edition not too long ago, Inigo, that I said, how do you know when an athlete's taper is going well? And he commented, because they feel good.
Yeah, that's one thing. But I'll tell you something. When you start reading the book, the one copy out of those 61 copies left, in part 3 of that book, I invited world-class athletes and coaches to contribute their ideas about tapering and how they prepared for a particular event, etc. And those contributions are divided in endurance sports, sprint and power events, team sports, and precision sports. And I have a contribution from Bob Bowman, Michael Phelps' coach. There is something very interesting that he says in there, and it is that you shouldn't pay too much attention on how an athlete feels on a particular day in the lead up to competition. Because sometimes if we are not very confident in our program, if we are not very confident in what we are doing, we might have a tendency to overreact to how the athlete feels on a particular day. So let's say you are 5 days out of competition and a swimmer arrives at the pool and says, fuck, I feel like crap today. And then you might panic and you might say, oh, I'm doing everything wrong. I'm giving him too much recovery, or I'm not giving her enough recovery. I have to modify my program. No. If you have a process in place and the process has been going well and the athletes have been adapting to that process and you know what you are doing and why you are doing it, trust the process. Don't panic. Don't overreact. Maybe the next day that same athlete is going to feel great and everything is going to be back to normal. So do not overreact by how an athlete feels on a given day, even if we are close to competition. There has been a process behind. We all have good days and bad days. Yep. You might have bad days at work as a physio, and I might have bad days at lecturing, or I might have a bad day at getting blood out of the earlobe of an athlete to get a blood lactate sample. Some days you might have a bad day. So do athletes. They might have a bad day. They don't feel good. That doesn't mean that things are not where they should be. So yes, listen to the athlete, communicate with the athlete, learn together about how they adapt and how they disadapt after the event, but believe in the process if you know what you are doing.
Yeah, so that's a really great point, Inigo, and it makes me think that most athletes, or it seems to be a common observation or something that I've heard and even experienced in my own 30 years around endurance sports, and that is you often don't feel great in a taper.
Correct.
What are the drivers or the mechanisms behind that? Is it just perception, or is there actually that fatigue's doing something physiologically?
Yeah, and change is taking place in your body. I remember once when I was coaching Eneko Llanos, the day before a half Ironman event that he has won 12 times, we were going up the stairs of his apartment, and I was walking behind him. He was living in I think it was the 4th floor or the 5th floor, and he was gasping for air going up the stairs. And I was walking behind him and thinking, is this the guy who's going to win tomorrow? It's like, suddenly I mentioned that, and he said, sometimes I feel like I'm tired in the lead up to the main event, but that only tells me that I am waiting for that explosion of energy to come out on the day of competition, or something along those lines. I thought, wow, that's interesting, because I thought I was walking behind an old man up the stairs. He obviously didn't feel great going up those stairs, but then when he got on the bike, or when he put on the running shoes, that's a different story.
So don't be alarmed, don't panic if you're not feeling great. Inigo, on the training intensity, I think a myth or a belief that many people have is that leading up to an event, they want to reduce the volume. That's commonly, obviously known, not necessarily always executed well for a variety of reasons. But the intensity, there's often that adage, don't go too hard before your event. You don't want to, burn all the fuel before the event. But are there any guidelines around that? Like how much, has it just got to do with not so much the intensity, but more the volume of the intensity?
Correct. Yeah. When we say that you have to keep the intensity up, that doesn't mean that you have to do everything intensity. You also reduce the training volume of high intensity training, but you don't reduce the intensity of training. So the percentage of the volume that you do at high intensity might go up a little bit, but otherwise it remains stable. So let's say you are doing 80% low to moderate intensity and 20% high intensity. That's just an example. During your taper, you may maintain that relative volume of intensity, but drop everything simultaneously. So you are dropping the overall volume, but you are maintaining the amount of high-intensity training, or the relative amount of high-intensity training that you are doing. And another option that we have used with success in middle-distance runners, for example, is to eliminate volume at the expense of low-intensity training. And in that case, obviously, the percentage of high intensity that you are doing would go up because you are eliminating mostly from the low to moderate intensity area. But that doesn't mean that you should suddenly start increasing the intensity. And usually say you're not supposed to run the marathon before the marathon. You don't want to do your event before your event. Yeah. Particularly if that event is really grueling and very demanding. I mean, why go 42 kilometers in training when you have to go 42 kilometers in competition a few days later? So you're not supposed to do your event before your event.
And I guess that feeds well, Inigo, into the psychological changes or processes that are occurring with tapering. I guess anyone that did run a hard marathon 3 days out from the marathon they were trying to perform at their best for, psychologically would probably be quite burdened by that. So what are the psychological elements athletes, practitioners, coaches need to be aware of through the taper phase?
Well, we have looked at that too, and some of the findings are that the taper not only induces physiological changes, it also induces psychological changes, and those are characterized by a reduced perception of effort for a given training intensity, a reduced perception of fatigue, an increased perception of vigor. That's something that you can assess with different scales, like the POMS, the Profile of Mood State Scale. quite often you might improve the quality of your sleep, which obviously is going to benefit your ability to recover from intensive training. And that psychologically is going to put you in a situation where you want to go out there and display what you got. I remember 24 hours before Eneko Llanos won that long distance world championships. At the time I was working at the AIS in Australia, so we were communicating by SMS. We didn't have WhatsApp or Zoom or any of these things at the time in 2003. And 24 hours before the race, I sent him a text message. How do you feel? And he said, I'm very relaxed and well rested. I have great sensations and I'm competition hungry. That's the exact sentence that he said in Basque, not in English. That is a good description of how an athlete should feel if everything is going well in the lead up to competition. I'm very relaxed and well rested. That tells you that mentally he's not stressed at all about the competition, and physically the fatigue has disappeared. That can be shown when he goes out and trains. Even though he's not training a lot, he feels good. The sensations are fantastic. And because the sensations are great and the perception is great, that puts him in a mood to want to go out there and display everything he's got. That's why he said, I'm competition hungry. And wow. The way that race went was, he set a pace on the bike, and after 40 kilometers, there was a climb. And he didn't attack on that climb. He simply set a pace that he knew that was his pace. And when he looked back, there was no one there. And they didn't see him until the finish line. You know, that's what coaches should be looking for. That type of feeling, that type of psychological state in an athlete when everything has been going according to plan.
Yeah, what a nice sentence. Very relaxed plus well-rested plus competition hungry. You're listening to Inigo Mujika, high-performance sports physiologist, researcher and tapering expert on this expert edition on all things tapering for endurance athletes. Support for today's show comes from the Physical Performance Show's all-new Learnings membership, where you can support the production of the show from just $5 per month, and in doing so, we'll grant you access to all back-catalogued live stream events and all upcoming live stream events for 2021 and beyond. In 2020, we hosted Dr. Stephen Seiler, forefather of all things polarized training, for his live stream, Sustainable Training for Attainable Endurance Goals, and then also Dr. Shona Halson, recovery expert, for her highly popular live stream, Recovery Essentials for Optimal Performance. And as a Physical Performance Show Learnings member, you'll receive access to both of those live stream events, normally ticketed at $49 per person, plus also complimentary access to all live stream events into the future. To pledge your support for the production of the show, it's simple. Jump over to Patreon, Patreon, search for the Physical Performance Show and become a patron of the show. Support for today's show also comes from Pogo Physio's online telehealth consultations. If you are an endurance athlete struggling with bone, tendon, or joint-related concerns, then our online 45-minute telehealth consultations can serve as an ideal platform to help you get back to your physical best, irrespective of where you are in the world. To find out more about Pogo Physio's award-winning online telehealth consultations with myself or any of the Pogo Physio team, jump over to pogophysio.com.au/telehealth. For now, let's jump back with this week's guest, Inigo Mujika, on this, an expert edition on all things tapering for the endurance athlete. Inigo, so that's the psychological changes touched on there. What about the physiological changes that a taper induces? What's actually happening physiologically?
Well, different studies with different athletes have shown that during the taper you might increase your VO2 max, you might increase your lactic threshold, You might increase, of course, your glycogen concentration. You might increase the contractile properties of your muscle fibers, and therefore you increase your strength, you increase your power production. You might even increase your red blood cell production, so there might be an erythropoiesis going on. It doesn't mean that you should expect all of these changes as a result of the taper. But some of these changes are certainly going to be taking place. And all of those contribute to what we call fitness. So in our mathematical modeling, when we talk about increasing your fitness level and decreasing your accumulated fatigue, that's what we mean in physiological terms. It means that when we say fitness is increasing, well, it means that maybe your VO2 max is increasing, maybe your running efficiency is increasing, maybe your blood lactic threshold or your lactic threshold is increasing, or maybe all three of them are increasing. So you are getting physiological changes that we translate as fitness, or we translate as dissipating fatigue, when we summarize positive changes and dissipation of negative effects of training.
So the fitness is underpinned by these physiological changes, but it's not so black and white, I imagine, Inigo, to say that the decrease or the reduction in the fatigue is psychological only. That's obviously physiological as well.
Yes, of course. And one of the things that improves is the neuromuscular system. And we know that as soon as you provide some type of rest and recovery, the neuromuscular system is going to rebound, and you are going to be able to produce more force and more power. Fast twitch fibers have been shown to be particularly respondent to the taper. So there have been some studies looking at single fibers, and they've seen that those fast twitch fibers respond really well to the taper. So they are able to produce much more power and faster than before the taper. And
the slow twitch fibers, what's happening to those?
Also, they also respond, but the response of the fast twitch fibers seems to be even higher. Yeah.
Inigo, this is a big topic, and it's not as simple as just doing less training before an event, as we're clearly finding out here. Any tips for managing nutrition and hydration before a taper?
Yes,
during a taper, my correction.
That's very important, because obviously we've been saying that the taper is a period of reduced training load. And if we are reducing the training load, we're going to have to reduce the energy intake. Otherwise, there is going to be a positive balance, and we are going to end up gaining weight at the worst possible time in the lead up to the important competition we're preparing for. So basically, we need to balance the energy intake with the reduced energy expenditure that characterizes the taper. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, the question about macronutrient distribution in our diet, the recommendation is that if it was correct before the taper, it's probably still correct during the taper. Because don't forget that during the taper, we are still training, and we are still training a lot. And we are doing intense work. So if the macronutrient distribution in our diet was appropriate before the taper, it's still going to be appropriate during the taper. And in fact, the studies that have looked at the respiratory exchange ratio, that gives us an indication of how much of the energy is coming from carbohydrate and how much of it is coming from fat, doesn't change during the taper. That respiratory exchange ratio, either at maximal exercise intensity or at submaximal exercise intensity, doesn't change during the taper. So therefore, if what we put on our plate before the taper was correct, it's still correct during the taper. Unless we want to manipulate the carbohydrate intake in the final days leading up to an endurance event for our glycogen supercompensation. In that case, we might do a carbohydrate loading phase, but it's not going to last the entire taper. It's going to last the final 48 hours or 72 hours, not the entire taper period. That's what I could say about body composition and diet. because there is a study with long distance triathletes showing that although they were training much less, they did 4-week follow-up of intensive training and then a 2-week taper. And the athletes were ingesting the same amount of energy during intensive training and during the taper, but the energy expenditure was reduced.
Yep.
During the taper. So they increased their body fat percentage in the lead up to the competition. And the same finding was observed in long distance runners. So we have to be very careful to balance energy intake with energy expenditure.
Yeah, so that's really, really nice distinction. The distribution of the macronutrients is probably going to be, or is going to be unchanged, but the volume, the energy balance is going to be different. So we need to take that into account. And
yeah, one tip that I usually give to athletes and to coaches and that I make sure that it's happening is we want to get to competition body mass and competition body composition at the beginning of the taper and make sure that doesn't change during the taper. So we usually do skin folds and body mass before we start tapering. And then we tell the athletes, this is the body mass that you should maintain for the next couple of weeks. Because if you are focusing too much on body composition and body mass all the way to the lead up of the race, then you're not focusing on going fast. And that should be your main goal, going fast.
Wow,
you have to take away other distractions. Forget about body mass. You know everything is there. Forget about body composition. You know it's the right one before you start tapering. During the taper, focus on racing. And that's a strategy that we use with our swimmers, for example.
Yeah, that's amazing, and it makes sense. Remove the stress around that body mass and composition by getting there at the start of the taper. And then we also, excuse me, but we also know that in the final 2 to 3 days before an endurance event, your body mass is going to go up because you're going to be carbo loading. Yeah.
And along with that, there is going to be a water retention. So you might show up to the start line of a half Ironman weighing 2.5 kilos more than your weight or your body mass 5 days before. So your body mass at the start line is not your real body mass.
Yeah, because of that water content due to the glycogen boost that the athletes have done, which is often...
And the glycogen itself.
In the glycogen itself, there's often that panic, absolutely, isn't there, that I've gained weight, and then it's actually just basic science. Inigo, detraining effects. This is a big topic, and we haven't even touched on obviously things like the effect of altitude and travel, etc., which are all outlined in the review during a taper. But the detraining effects I find fascinating. What would you share around what happens if an athlete hits their event and then switches into, say, off-season? Say it's the end of their racing competitive phase. What are the things that an athlete or coach need to be aware of in terms of what's actually happening physiologically there?
Well, they need to be aware that things are going to disappear very quickly. Adaptations that they have reached throughout months of hard training are going to disappear very quickly. Within 2 to 3 weeks, we are going to see cardiovascular changes, metabolic changes, and neuromuscular changes. And none of them are fun to talk about from a performance point of view. That doesn't mean that we should always try to avoid detraining. You need the physical and the psychological recovery after a hard training season. But we need to keep it short enough to freshen up, but not to lose too much, because then the preseason is going to be too complicated. Or if we have another event coming up, we are going to lose too much, and it's going to be too difficult to get back to our usual levels. So my approach is usually 2 weeks of no training, absolutely no training. I know there are some things that are going to be lost in 2 weeks, and then 2 weeks of physical activity that doesn't have to do with or is not the usual sport. So if you are a triathlete, a couple of weeks of no cycling, no swimming, no running, just surfing, hiking in the mountains, playing tennis, whatever the athlete enjoys doing. And then after 4 weeks, so 2 weeks of nothing, 2 weeks of activity, and then after 4 weeks, we get back into triathlon training. But yeah, in 4 weeks, you're going to lose a lot of what you've got. For example, your VO2 max is going to disappear by 15% in about 6 weeks of no training. And after 10 days, more or less, you're going to lose 0.5% per day without training in terms of VO2 max.
Any more depressing news for us, Inigo?
Oh, yeah. Metabolically, you are going to have the same changes that we call the metabolic syndrome. So the metabolic syndrome that is characterized by overweight and or obesity, hypertension, insulin resistance, or diabetes, dyslipidemia, all of that can be seen in an elite athlete within 2 to 3 weeks of no training. In a small scale, at a smaller scale.
Yeah.
But the changes that take place are exactly the same. A few years ago, I wrote an editorial that it's called From Super Fit to Super Fat, talking about how the changes that we see in super fit athletes within 2 to 3 weeks of training stoppage are exactly the same that we see in the metabolic syndrome at a smaller scale.
But of course, any athletes hearing this that panic and think, well, I don't want to go from super fit to super fat. What would you say to that athlete around the benefits of taking that time out? Inigo, what would you say to that athlete or coach?
Yeah, one thing is that you might go down that path within 3 to 4 weeks, but not within 2 weeks. Within 2 weeks, some things are going to be lost, but not to an extent that you cannot recover them within a couple months of retraining. And the benefits of stopping are there. Physical benefits, injury prevention benefits. I remember in an interview that Eneco had years ago, they asked him, well, you never seem to be injured. Why is that? And one of the things he said that was very nice of him is that, well, my planning is really good. My coach plans the training so I don't get injured. And that means giving me enough rest on a weekly basis, giving me enough rest on a mesocycle or a monthly basis, and giving me enough rest at the end of the season. Taking a break, yes, it might induce some loss of physiological adaptations, but the benefits are going to be there. And one of the big benefits is allowing you to freshen up physically and mentally, and allowing you to stay injury-free in the mid to long term.
And as a physiotherapist, Inigo, we know that physically, the longer an athlete's gone without an injury, the bigger buffer they have in durability and resilience to likely not incur an injury. So it's just so critical from a tissue point of view.
Yes. And that's something you might get from taking a break.
Yeah.
At the end of a big training block.
Yeah. I mean, it's just impossible to be on your game all year round in anything, isn't it? I believe.
Losing some adaptation is the price you have to pay, but it's a small price compared to having to stop for 2 months because you have a severe injury.
Is there any science around how quickly the adaptations come back, or it's too variable? Like you mentioned the VO2 drop.
We are working on that. We're working on that at the moment. We're gonna come up with a big, very nice study from many different sports. For the first time, we had the possibility of looking at that thanks to COVID-19.
It's one person out of COVID-19.
Yeah, we have a huge database of athletes who had to stop training and then they had to come back. And we are going to be able to look at detraining plus retraining. That's one of the things in the scientific literature that is absolutely missing. Retraining after a period of detraining.
So watch this space academically and then the translation of that into the field.
We're still looking at it. We are still collecting the numbers. So we don't have any results yet. We are still collecting from different sports different lockdown periods, different retraining periods in the lead up to the first competition. So it's going to be, hopefully, it's going to give us a good idea of a progression from different athletes in different sports.
Which can then inform coaching practices.
Exactly, because when I do my lectures about detraining, there is one point about retaining training adaptations, also about retraining when we have lost those adaptations. And the point is that there is no scientific literature about retraining in elite athletes. There is literature about recovering from an injury, but not about retraining after a period of training cessation. There is one case study in the scientific literature about an Olympic champion in rowing that decided to stop after he became Olympic champion. He agreed to be followed during the stoppage. And then after a few weeks, he said, well, I've changed my mind. I'm coming back. And they report on the process of coming back. But that's all. We don't have information about the ideal ways of coming back after a period of training stoppage.
You're listening to Inigo Mujika, high-performance sports physiologist, researcher and tapering expert on this and expert edition, Tapering for Endurance Athletes. If you missed last week's episode, it was another expert edition featuring ENT surgeon Dr. Dan Robinson on an often overlooked area of health and performance, and that is navigating nasal obstruction. Here's a little snippet of Dr. Dan sharing from episode 253.
Would do approximately 4 or 5 ribs every week where you're then utilising rib cartilage to reconstruct the patient's nose, because their septum is probably not going to cut the mustard when it comes to reconstructing their nose and giving them a lasting result, which should last the rest of their life.
To enjoy the full episode and extract the many learnings that Dr. Dan Robinson shared, including the fact that 1 in 3 people experience nasal obstruction, which influences their health and performance, then be sure to jump over and enjoy the full episode. It's available wherever it is that you enjoy your podcasts from, all the podcast players, and of course we're over on YouTube now, the Physical Performance Show. For now, let's jump back with this week's guest, Inigo Mujika, high-performance sports physiologist, researcher and tapering expert on this expert edition, exploring all things tapering for endurance athletes. Inigo, I failed to mention that your review showed about a 3% improvement in competition performance if the taper went well. Anything you'd add to that?
Yes, I want to make clear that that's the percentage change between pre-taper performance compared to post-taper performance. It doesn't mean, sometimes people understand that, I'm going to improve my PB by 3%. It's not that.
Okay.
But the good thing about knowing this, that 3% is the number that comes up again and again. Obviously, there is going to be a range of performance improvements that usually goes between 0.5 and 6 to 7%. But the good thing about having those numbers is that they are going to allow athletes and coaches to make realistic performance predictions for competition. So let's say you have an athlete who is running the 400 in 60 seconds. Well, don't tell her that she will be running in 52 in 3 weeks' time or in 2 weeks' time, because she's likely to be running in 58.2 to 59.5. She's not going to be running in 52.
Okay, so it's an important distinction.
So we can make realistic performance predictions based on an athlete's performance in the lead up to the taper.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense, and it is a great distinction. Inigo, if you had to boil everything you've learnt through your extensive career to date, which is still ongoing, as you say, there's more to be learnt and there's more research being done. But if you had to boil everything into one piece of advice to help listeners of this show perform at their best, what would Inigo Mujika's one piece of advice be?
Believe in the process of training.
Believe in the process of training.
Yes. Don't panic because of how you feel. Just if you have a process in place, believe in it and go with it.
Believe in the process of training. It's powerful. Inigo, every guest of the show also issues listeners with a physical challenge for the week. So what is Inigo Mujika's physical challenge going to be?
This week, I think this week, my surfing friends and I were supposed to ride our bikes to the surf, which is about 110 kilometers. But unfortunately, we might not be allowed because of the lockdown. We are not allowed to go across the border of our province. So no surfing and no riding to the coast. We might have to wait a few more days because I think that restriction is being lifted on the 23rd. So it won't be this week, but it will be next week. So the challenge of the week will be riding to the coast with my surfing mates.
And well, we need Twitter evidence of this ride taking place, Inigo, over on your Twitter handle. And
okay, we'll do that.
And Inigo, what would you lay down as a challenge for the listeners from this episode going live? What would be Inigo Mujika's challenge to the listeners?
If you don't feel like lifting weights because you are endurance athletes and quite often you don't feel like lifting weights, get off your bum and go and lift weights. Because that's going to improve your performance. That's a topic for a different day.
I mean, it's a recurring theme on this show from experts, obviously, Inigo, the importance of resistance training.
Correct. Yep. And you don't feel like lifting weights, go and lift weights. That's my challenge for the listeners. Brilliant.
And, you know, as a sports physio, it seems to be 98% of my work is overseeing strength and conditioning processes for injured athletes returning to competition. Inigo, absolutely brilliant. Projects, resources, you've got your great website, Inigo Mujika, which we'll tag up in the show notes. You're active on Twitter. And also, obviously, the library, the catalogue of books, in particular, the infographic copy of endurance training. Everyone likes pictures for learning and interpreting. But where can people interpret information? Where can people get their hands on these, Inigo?
Well, in my website, those books, I'm the editor, I'm the publisher, I'm the author. So they can be found in my website. That one, Endurance Training Infographic Edition, is a good, straight to the point version of endurance training science and practice. So for those athletes or practitioners who are not that interested in the science behind the facts and they want straight to the point recommendations, I think the infographic edition is a very good option to learn about endurance training, but straight to the point.
Yeah, everyone loves a good infographic. So, Inigo, we'll tag all that up in the show notes. And obviously, leading into Tokyo 2021, you've got your hands full with your role there with Spanish Aquatics. So, and all the other projects that you mentioned. So, certainly wish you all the best going into the new calendar year, Inigo. And thank you for your contribution and sharing so generously your expertise.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation.
So there you have it, another episode of the Physical Performance Show, and I know you took many learnings from Inigo Mujika's sharings. Inigo has contributed enormously to the scientific literature in the space of tapering and peaking and has published 5 books, including the seminal Tapering and Peaking for Optimal Performance, Endurance Training Science and Practice, Recovery for Performance in Sport, and the World Book of Swimming from Science to Performance. Now, we will link all of Inigo's resources up in the Pogo Physio show notes, including links to the scientific literature that Inigo referenced, Tapering for Competition, a review, and also an integrated multifactorial approach to periodization for optimal performance in individual and team sports. I recommend jumping over and following Inigo on Twitter. That's Inigo Mujika _EN. INIGOMUJIKA_EN. Of course, jump over to Inigo's website as well for a terrific blog and also further links to all of his 5 published books. That's inigomujika.com. Or simply jump over to Pogo Physio where you'll find all the links there. Keep the podsies coming. They are always a lot of fun. That's a screenshot of the episode that you're enjoying and tag it in the Physical Performance Show on social at Physical Performance Show on Instagram and also at TPS Show 1 on Twitter. Of course, we're on Facebook and the YouTube channel is now up and running. So jump over and subscribe there. A massive thanks to those leaving ratings and reviews over on iTunes, and also for those who have become patrons of the show through supporting the show's production over at Patreon and becoming Learnings members. A massive thanks this week to our newest patron, Joy McClymont. You can find Joy over on Instagram at Off the Track Training. Joy's a fitness trainer and creator of Joy's Fitness Hub, a 24-week program. So massive thank you, Joy, for your support for the production of the Physical Performance Show. As always, a huge thank you to the great folk who make this show possible each and every week. Daryl Misson, our audio engineer, Susan Wilkin on all things show administration, and Matthew Walding on all things show graphic design. Don't forget, if you are an endurance athlete experiencing ongoing bone, tendon, or joint-related concerns, then help can be as simple as an online 45-minute telehealth consultation with myself or any of the Pogo Physio team. And you can schedule that, book that online over at pogophysio.com.au/telehealth. Now, coming up on next week's episode of the Physical Performance Show, we jump from Australia, where we're recording, across the ditch to New Zealand and pick up a conversation with Triathlon New Zealand and Athletics New Zealand high performance coach Craig Kirkwood around all things coaching endurance athletes on a Coach's Corner episode. Now, Craig himself had an incredible athletics career with a PB of 2:13 across the marathon and 6 New Zealand international representations to his career. Craig is now the coach of some of the planet's hottest up-and-coming endurance talent, including Hayden Wild, triathlete, who was featured as a featured performer on episode 162 of the show, and also 1500, 3000 metre specialist, up-and-coming Sam Tanner. So be sure to be tuning in next week for many learnings from Craig Kirkwood. Until then, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.